Conrad Voss signed the transfer order without looking up from his phone. Room 402, Marcus Hale, palliative care. He capped his pen, straightened his tie, and walked out of Walter Reed like a man who had just approved a lunch menu, not an execution. Down the hall, a decorated Navy SEAL sniper was screaming himself to death, and the most powerful defense contractor in America had just made sure no one would stop it. What Voss didn't know was that she was already on her way. If this story hits you the way it hit me, subscribe to the channel right now and follow every part to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The fourth floor of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center had a section the staff called the cage. It wasn't on any official map. It didn't appear in any brochure. But every nurse, every orderly, every exhausted resident who had ever pulled a shift on that floor knew exactly what it meant. The cage was where they put the ones who were too dangerous to treat in the open ward and too decorated to transfer to a psychiatric facility. It was where the war came home and refused to leave. Room 402 had been occupied for 11 days. Dr. Philip Marsh stood behind the safety glass with his arms crossed, watching the man inside destroy what was left of the room. The IV pole was already on the floor. The blood pressure monitor had been hurled into the corner. The tray that had held a meal 3 hours ago was upended against the far wall, and the man responsible for all of it was still pulling at the leather restraints with the focused intensity of someone who had spent his entire adult life solving problems through force. Master Chief Marcus Hale, 42 years old, SEAL Team 6, 17 years of service, classified deployments across 4 continents, 2 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, and a list of commendations that filled 2 pages of a file that even Marsh wasn't fully cleared to read. The official record called him one of the most effective long-range shooters in the history of naval special warfare. His teammates, the ones still alive, called him Shepherd. Right now, Shepherd was calling out to people who weren't there. Left side, watch the ridge." His voice was raw and cracking, the sound of a man who had been shouting for hours. "Rourke, get down right now." Marsh uncapped his pen and marked the chart. "Fever's at 104.3, he said without turning around. "We're losing the antibiotics battle. The sepsis is advancing faster than the infection protocol can address it." Nurse Carol Tate stood beside him, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had long since used up her capacity for surprise. "I had 3 nurses in that room today, doctor. He put Tommy Reeves into the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. The kid's got a concussion and 2 loose teeth." "How is he still pulling the restraints that hard?" "Because he's Marcus Hale," Carol said flatly. "His body doesn't know it's supposed to be dying. Nobody told the machine to stop." Inside the room, Marcus lunged forward against the leather cuffs. The metal frame of the hospital bed lifted off the floor bolts on one side and slammed back down. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing the room. They were seeing something else entirely. Something 3 years old and 10,000 miles away. Something that lived in the part of his brain the fever had unlocked like a kicked-in door. "Foxglove 6, we have movement at the tree line. I'm calling it now. I'm calling it." He stopped. His head dropped. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing through damaged lungs and a body running a temperature that should have rendered him unconscious. "Where are you?" He whispered it this time, the command voice gone, something fractured underneath it. "Where did you go?" Carol shook her head slowly. "He keeps saying that. Where are you?" "For 11 days. Whoever he's looking for in there, they never answer." Marsh set the clipboard down on the counter. "I've consulted with psychiatry twice. Dr. Ellison came in personally, and Marcus threw a bedpan at him before he got through the door. We've maxed haloperidol and hit the ceiling on Ativan. His metabolism processes it like water. I have no pharmacological path left that doesn't risk cardiac arrest." He paused. I'm recommending medically induced coma within the hour. It's the only way to keep the antibiotics in long enough to fight the infection. If you sedate him that deep, Carol said slowly, with his current cardiovascular stress. It's a risk, Marsh said, but the alternative is watching him die awake. The door to the nursing station opened. Neither of them heard it over the sound of Marcus screaming another order at a ghost. The woman who walked in was quiet in the way that people who have learned to move through serious spaces tend to be quiet. She wasn't small, and she wasn't large. She was the kind of person who occupied exactly the space she needed, and no more. Brown hair pulled back, scrubs that were clean but not new, a thermos of coffee held in both hands like ballast. Her badge read, D. Cross, RN. I'm here for the 1900 shift, she said. Carol turned around surprised. Mitchell, she stopped checking the badge. Cross, Diane Cross. You're the agency transfer from Mercy General. That's right. Carol looked her up and down with the frankly appraising gaze of a head nurse who had seen 40 years of agency staff come through her floor. You understand this is a high-security trauma unit. We're not doing routine post-op recovery up here. I read the briefing, Diane said. The briefing, Marsh said, turning fully now, does not adequately convey the situation. He gestured at the glass. That man has a traumatic brain injury, active sepsis from 3 infected gunshot wounds, severe PTSD with acute psychotic features, and a documented history of violence against medical personnel in the last 72 hours. We are 20 minutes away from putting him into a coma to save his life. Diane Cross walked to the safety glass. She stood there and she watched Marcus the way you watch something that you recognize, the way you watch something that you have been thinking about for a very long time. Marcus had gone quieter for a moment. He was breathing in short, shallow pulls, his eyes moving rapidly, tracking things on the ceiling that existed only in the fever dream running behind his pupils. His lips were moving. Diane watched his mouth. Carol moved up beside her. They all do that eventually, talk themselves down for a few minutes and then it spikes back up. The psychiatrist thinks he's reliving a specific event on a loop, something from a classified deployment. We can't get the details because the file is redacted 6 ways from Sunday. She paused. Honestly, at this point, knowing what he's reliving wouldn't change the treatment plan. Diane said, "Don't put him in the coma." The words landed with a particular flatness that stopped both Marsh and Carol cold. Marsh turned. "Excuse me. Medically induced sedation at his current cardiac stress level is a significant mortality risk," Diane said, still watching Marcus through the glass. "And if you sedate him that deeply while he's in a dissociative episode, you trap him in it. You're not giving his brain a rest. You're locking him inside the nightmare with no way out." Marsh stared at her. "You're a floor nurse from a general hospital." "I'm also right," Diane said. The room was quiet for a second, except for the muffled sounds from 402. "Even if that's true," Marsh said, his voice careful and professional and utterly unconvinced, "the alternative is allowing the infection to advance while he fights off every IV we try to place. He needs antibiotics in his bloodstream within the hour. That requires a stable venous access point. That requires him to hold still for approximately 90 seconds. In 11 days, nobody has achieved that. So unless you have a specific suggestion, let me go in." This time the silence lasted longer. Carol laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had been scared enough times in the last 11 days that laughter was the only response left that didn't involve crying. "Honey, I've got 22 years on this floor. I've worked with burn patients, with TBI patients, with men who came back from places that don't officially exist and left the worst parts of themselves over there. I have never, in 22 years, sent a new staff member into a room like that one without a security team." "He's not going to hurt me," Diane said. "He put a maintenance worker through a door this morning," Carol said. "A 230-pound man. Through a door." "He's not going to hurt me," Diane said again. And something in the way she said it the second time, the particular quality of certainty that wasn't bravado and wasn't recklessness, made Carol stop talking. Marsh looked at Diane for a long moment. He was a doctor. He had a liability framework and a duty of care and an incident report system that had already generated more paperwork from room 402 than any other patient that year. He had every professional reason in the world to say no. He also had a man behind that glass who was going to be dead by morning if something didn't change. "If he comes at you," Marsh said quietly, "security is 30 seconds out. You press the call button on the wall or you scream, and we are through that door." "Understood," Diane said. "You sign a liability waiver before you go in." "Already planning on it." Carol handed her a gown and gloves without another word. Her hands, Diane noticed, were completely steady as she suited up. No hesitation in the fingers. No visible fear in the set of her shoulders. Carol had seen nervous nurses, and she had seen reckless nurses, and she had seen brave nurses. And what she was looking at right now was something she didn't have a clean category for. Diane Cross walked to the door of room 402 and badged in. The magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy click. She pushed the door open and she stepped inside. The smell hit first. Antiseptic and sweat, and beneath both of those, the specific iron salt smell of old blood that no amount of cleaning entirely removes. The room was dim. The overhead light had been broken 2 days ago and replaced with a wall-mounted fixture that cast everything in a low yellow tone that made the shadows sharper. Marcus Hale turned his head. His eyes found her immediately. They were bloodshot and fever-bright, and the pupils were dilated so wide the gray of his irises was almost gone. He had the look of a man whose brain had been running at maximum capacity for 11 days straight and was starting to eat itself for fuel. The restraints had worn the skin at both wrists raw. The fresh suture line down his torso, where the field surgery had been hastily closed, was showing the dull red of inflammation. He did not see a nurse. In the landscape his fever had constructed, she was something else entirely. "Contact," he said. His voice had the cracked, hollow quality of someone who had been shouting for days. "Contact, North Side. Who are you?" Diane didn't raise her hands. She didn't use the slow, open palm gesture that every de-escalation training module taught as the universal signal for non-threat. She stood completely still, with her hands at her sides, and she looked at him directly. Not at his forehead the way you were taught to look at aggressive patients. Not at the middle distance. At him. "Marcus," she said. "Not Master Chief, not Sir, not Mr. Hale. Marcus." He flinched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The way a man flinches when someone says a name they haven't heard in a long time. "Don't come closer," he said. He had worked his right hand partially free of the restraint. His fingers found the plastic water pitcher on the side table. "I will end you. I swear to God, I will end you." Diane took one step forward. The pitcher came at her. It was a hard, overhand swing from a man who still had the muscle memory of someone trained to kill, even if the body delivering it was failing. It connected with her left shoulder with enough force to raise an immediate bruise. She absorbed it. She didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She used his overextension to close the remaining distance to the bedrail in 2 fast steps. She leaned down. Her face was inches from his. He was winding up again, his free hand coming around, and she could see in his eyes the moment the decision formed, the moment the threat assessment completed and the response initiated, and she spoke before it could arrive. 3 words, not 5 this time, 3. "Shepherd, foxglove, down." Marcus Hale stopped. It was not a gradual stopping. It was not the slow de-escalation of a man talked carefully back from a ledge. It was instantaneous. His arm dropped. His shoulders dropped. The furious kinetic energy that had been running through him like current through a wire cut off completely, and what was left was something far more frightening than the rage had been. Confusion. Real confusion. The kind that comes when the world you have been living in for 11 days collides without warning with a world you had stopped believing was real. His eyes locked onto hers. The pupils were still dilated, but the quality of the focus had changed. He wasn't tracking threats anymore. He was trying to identify something. Who? His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Who are you? Outside the safety glass, Dr. Philip Marsh had both hands flat against the window. His mouth was open. Beside him, Carol Tate had gone absolutely still, her coffee mug halfway to her lips, forgotten. What did she say to him? Marsh whispered. Carol shook her head slowly. Her eyes didn't leave the room. Inside 402, Diane Cross reached down and began gently loosening the restraint that was cutting into Marcus Hale's left wrist. He watched her hands. He didn't pull away. He watched with the careful, exhausted attention of a man trying to solve an equation that shouldn't have a solution. The infection is winning, Diane said softly. Her voice had returned to professional calm, but her eyes stayed on his, and she did not look away. I need to get the antibiotics in. I need you to hold still for me, Marcus. 90 seconds, that's all. He swallowed. His throat worked. You said the code, he rasped. That's a classified comm channel. That's foxglove. That's a dead operation. Nobody knows that designation. I know it, Diane said. How? She picked up the IV line from where it had been pulled free and discarded. Her movements were precise and practiced and completely unhurried. Because I was on the other end of it, she said. 3 years ago. The Korengal Valley, I was the voice in your ear for 6 hours. The monitor above the bed, which had been screaming tachycardia warnings for the better part of the shift, began to slow. Marcus stared at her. You, the word came out broken. You're the one who told me to hold the ridge. Yes. You're the one who was there when Danny Rourke... He stopped. His jaw clenched hard enough that the muscles at his temples jumped. You were there when he died. Diane Cross did not look away. She held the needle steady. I was there, she said. I've been there every day since. The room was quiet. Outside the glass, Carol Tate finally set her coffee mug down. Her hand was shaking slightly. She had worked trauma nursing for 22 years, and she had never in her life seen a human being go from the edge of cardiac violence to complete stillness in the span of 30 seconds. She had no framework for it. She had no protocol that covered it. What in God's name, she said quietly, does that woman know about him? Marsh didn't answer. He was watching Diane place the IV with the steady hands of someone who had done difficult things in difficult circumstances before and had made peace with the difficulty. He was watching Marcus Hale, Master Chief, shepherd, the most dangerous patient on the 4th floor, extend his arm and hold it still. He had no answer either. But whatever Diane Cross knew about the man in room 402, it was something that had cut through 11 days of fever and rage and dissociation in 3 words flat. And that, Marsh understood with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with medicine, meant she was something other than what her badge said she was. The antibiotics began to drip. Marcus Hale closed his eyes. For the first time in 11 days, the screaming stopped. The antibiotics had been running for 40 minutes when Marcus Hale spoke again. His voice was different now. The fever dream quality was still there. The rough edges of a man whose body was fighting a war on 2 fronts simultaneously. But underneath it, something had shifted. The animal panic was gone. What replaced it was something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. It was the focused, careful attention of a trained operator processing new intelligence. You said 3 words, he said. His eyes were still closed. Shepherd, foxglove, down. That's a stand-down code. That's a specific stand-down code from a specific operation. That's not something you find in any database that exists on an unclassified server. Diane was seated on the rolling stool beside his bed, charting his vitals with one hand and watching his color improve incrementally with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose immediate problem was being solved. She didn't look up from the chart. No, she agreed, it isn't. So either you have a clearance level that doesn't show up on a Walter Reed transfer badge, Marcus said, or someone sent you in here with a specific key and a specific purpose. Both of those things can be true at the same time. He opened his eyes then. The pupils had contracted slightly as the fever began its first, slow retreat. The gray of his irises was visible again, and it was the particular gray of cold water, clear and very deep. He turned his head and looked at her directly for the first time, without the filter of hallucination between them. "Who are you?" he said. Not the broken, whispered version from 20 minutes ago. This was the operator's voice, flat, precise, requiring an answer. Diane set the chart tablet on the side table. She looked at him. "My name is Diane Cross. I'm a registered nurse, licensed in Virginia and Maryland. Before that, I was an intelligence analyst, GS-14, assigned to the NSA's SIGINT Directorate and seconded to JSOC for the duration of Operation Foxglove." The monitor blipped once, twice. His heart rate had kicked up 6 beats per minute. "JSOC," he said, "Joint Special Operations Command. I was the Tactical Communications Officer for your team's deployment to Korengal in November of 2021. I was in the TOC at Bagram. I was the voice on your channel for the entire operation." Marcus stared at the ceiling. His jaw was working. She could see him pulling the memory up from wherever the fever and the trauma had buried it, reassembling the pieces the way you reassemble a rifle in the dark, by feel and muscle memory because your eyes can't help you. 6 hours, he said finally. You were on channel for 6 hours. 6 hours and 14 minutes. You called the thermal signature 2 clicks north. I did. You told us to hold the ridge. I did. He was quiet for a moment. The ventilator in the corner clicked softly. Somewhere down the hall, a call button was chiming, distant and irrelevant. And then the comms went down, Marcus said. His voice had dropped. And Rourke took a round to the neck. And the mortars started walking up the slope. And I was the only one left on that ridge when the medevac finally came. He stopped. 2 hours late. Yes. The medevac was 2 hours late because somebody scrambled the extraction coordinates, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. He was reconstructing it in real time, pulling threads that had been loose for 3 years and finding where they connected. I always knew that. I knew it wasn't a navigation error. The pilot was too good. Somebody gave him wrong numbers on purpose. Diane said nothing. Were you still on the channel when the comms went down? She took a breath. Your radio went dead at hour 4. Physical damage to the unit from the mortar concussion. I lost your signal, but I stayed on the frequency. She paused. My supervisor ordered me to switch channels and help coordinate the air support package. I refused. I stayed on your personal comm line, and I kept talking for 2 hours because I didn't know if your radio was dead or if you could still hear me and just couldn't respond. Marcus turned his head and looked at her again with an expression that was impossible to read. I thought I imagined you, he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he didn't try to smooth it over. Later, in the hospital in Germany, and then the VA, I could remember a voice, but I couldn't attach a face to it, and eventually I decided my brain had manufactured it to keep me company while I was bleeding out. You didn't manufacture it? No. He looked back at the ceiling. I didn't. Outside the glass doctor, Marsh had been joined by the night security supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Garrett who had served 2 tours in Iraq before transitioning to hospital security and who was watching the scene in room 402 with the particular expression of a veteran recognizing something he didn't have civilian language for. She should not be alone in there, Garrett said. She's been alone in there for 45 minutes, Marsh replied, and he hasn't moved except to breathe. I'm not opening that door. Carol was still at her position at the monitoring station. She had been watching the biometric readouts for the entire duration of Diane's time in the room. Temperature, still elevated but trending down for the first time in 4 days. Heart rate, elevated but stable. Blood pressure, improving. She pulled up the medication administration log and checked the timestamp on the antibiotic infusion. Running clean, no interruptions. She had worked this floor for 22 years, and she had never charted a recovery curve that looked like this. 11 days of deterioration, and then 45 minutes with one woman, and the numbers were moving in the right direction for the first time. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or frightened. Back in the room, Marcus had been quiet for several minutes. Not the disassociative silence of before, not the silence of a man whose brain was running somewhere else. The silence of someone processing information with full cognitive function for the first time in days. The intel was wrong, he said. Yes. The compound wasn't a command cell planning an attack. We weren't walking into a high-value target meeting. No, you weren't. Then what were we walking into? Diane reached into the pocket of her scrub top and removed a small folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully and held it where he could see it without sitting up. It was a printed page, small font, numbers and a name at the top. Look at the medication order at the bottom, she said. Marcus squinted. His vision was still compromised by the fever, but the numbers were large enough. He read them. He went still in a different way than before, a colder way. Potassium chloride, he said, 40 milliequivalents in a 50 milliliter bag, scheduled for the 0600 IV line. He knew what that number meant. He had been a combat medic in his first years of service before the sniper pipeline. He had pushed potassium in the field for cardiac resuscitation in very specific doses, carefully titrated. This dose was not a resuscitation dose. This dose was a termination dose, cardiac arrest within minutes, indistinguishable on a post-mortem from the sepsis-related cardiac event that everyone in this building was already anticipating. Who ordered it? He said. A physician listed as Dr. Raymond Cho, consulting cardiologist. And Dr. Raymond Cho retired from clinical practice 14 months ago and does not have active admitting privileges at this hospital. His credentials were used to access the order system remotely at 2200 hours tonight. The monitor alarm tripped briefly as his heart rate spiked. He breathed through it, deliberately. One breath in, hold, out. Someone inside this hospital is planning to kill me tonight, he said. Someone inside this hospital is planning to kill you at 6 in the morning, Diane corrected, which gives us approximately 8 hours. He stared at her. You came here to tell me this. I came here because when I saw your transfer order to palliative care across my desk 3 days ago, I knew you didn't have enough time left for the official channels to work. What transfer order? I wasn't told about any transfer. You wouldn't have been. It was generated from outside your chain of care. Someone with administrative access pushed it through as a quality of care upgrade. Private room, reduced monitoring, palliative focus. She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. Palliative means comfort-focused. It means they pull back the aggressive treatment. It means the infection wins on a more acceptable timeline. Marcus processed this. And if the infection took too long, the potassium at 0600 provides a deadline. He closed his eyes again, but it wasn't the closing of someone retreating. It was the closing of someone running calculations behind their eyelids. 3 years of fractured memory and suppressed evidence, and a body that had been trying to die for 11 days were suddenly arranging themselves into a shape that had a logic to it. The Korengal operation, he said. We weren't hitting a command cell. No. What were we hitting? Diane leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped even further, below the threshold of the room's ambient noise. You were hitting what your intelligence brief described as a high-value meeting between Taliban regional leadership. The brief was generated from signal intercepts that came through my desk. I analyzed the data. I assessed the area as operationally viable. I gave the green light. But the data was wrong. The data was fabricated, not by me. I didn't know that until 4 days after the operation, when I started running the source traces and found the intercepts had been seeded through a cutout in the Afghan logistics network. She paused. The meeting you walked into wasn't Taliban leadership. It was a financial exchange. An American contractor was delivering a cash and product payment to a local warlord in exchange for protection of a supply route. Marcus opened his eyes. An American, he said, a private military contractor. His company holds logistics contracts with the Department of Defense worth approximately $6 billion over the next decade. His supply convoys move through that valley 4 times a month. He had been paying the local insurgent network to leave his trucks alone for 2 years. And my team walked right into the middle of a payment drop. You saw the exchange. You called it in over your radio. You reported a Western non-combatant interacting with the target. That transmission was recorded and flagged at the TOC within 30 seconds. Her jaw tightened. The ambush that followed wasn't opportunistic. The ambush was already in place. The bad intel that put you on that ridge was designed to put you on that ridge, at that time, for the express purpose of having the warlord's men do what they did. The silence that followed this was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a man reordering his entire understanding of the worst night of his life. Rourke, Marcus said. His voice was very quiet. Danny Rourke died because some contractor didn't want witnesses to his payoff. Diane didn't answer. She didn't need to. Who? Marcus said. One word, but it carried everything. She reached into her other pocket and produced a folded photograph, a printout. A man in a dark suit at what appeared to be a government function, shaking hands with a senator. Silver hair, square jaw, the smile of a man who had never in his adult life worried about consequences. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long time. Conrad Voss, he said. Diane's head came up sharply. You know him? I saw him at Bagram. A week before the operation, he was in the officer's mess with the battalion commander. Expensive suit, didn't belong there. Marcus's eyes stayed on the photograph. He looked at my team the way you look at equipment, like he was assessing load-bearing capacity. He stopped. I remember thinking I'd never seen a civilian look at soldiers that way before, like we were line items. He is the CEO of Axiom Defense Solutions, Diane said. The company behind the logistics contracts and the protection payments and the fabricated intel that put your team in that valley. And he's the one who ordered the potassium. He has a financial interest in ensuring you never fully remember what you saw in that compound. You called in a Western non-combatant. That radio transmission exists in the classified record. If you're ever coherent enough and credible enough to testify to what you saw, combined with the signal data I have been holding for 3 years. What signal data? Diane met his eyes. When I ran the source traces after the operation, before my supervisor ordered me to destroy the raw intercepts and close the file, I made a copy of everything. The original transmissions, the fabricated overlays, the financial routing data that was embedded in the communication traffic. She held his gaze. I've been carrying that encrypted drive for 3 years, waiting for the moment when it could actually be used. Marcus stared at her. You've had evidence of a conspiracy to murder American military personnel for 3 years, he said slowly, and you waited. I needed you, she said simply. The data alone is encrypted with a rolling key I can't crack without the source code from Axiom servers. And without a credible witness who can corroborate the visual evidence from the compound, a defense attorney shreds the signal data in 30 minutes as circumstantial. I needed the man who looked through the scope and saw Conrad Voss's contractor hand a briefcase to a warlord. She paused. I needed Shepard. The monitor beeped steadily. The antibiotics dripped. Down the hall, the night shift was moving through its quiet routines, entirely unaware that in room 402, the architecture of a federal treason case was being assembled between a woman who had blown up her career to preserve one file and a man who had nearly died protecting a truth he didn't yet know he was carrying. Marcus looked at the clock on the wall. 11:58 p.m. 6 hours and 2 minutes until someone walked through that door with a bag of potassium chloride and a chart that said, routine morning medication. You said you needed me, Marcus said. Needed me alive and coherent, not sedated, not transferred to palliative, not dead of a convenient cardiac event at 6 in the morning. His eyes moved to the window, to the dark parking lot visible through the blinds. Which means you came here tonight with more than information. Diane Cross stood up from the rolling stool. She moved to the supply cart in the corner, the large one on the bottom shelf that had arrived with her at the start of her shift, and that Carol Tate had not looked at closely because it was standard agency transfer equipment, and nobody looked closely at standard things. She unzipped the lower compartment. Inside, Marcus could see the edge of what appeared to be a folded black bag. Heavy-gauge polyethylene, the kind used for one specific purpose in a hospital. He looked at it. He looked at her. You have got to be kidding me, he said. The morgue elevator doesn't require a security badge, Diane said. It's the only elevator in this building that goes to the basement loading bay without a clearance scan. The orderly who runs the night transport is named Stan Kowalski. He takes his break at 01:30, and he's gone for exactly 12 minutes. Marcus looked at the body bag. He looked at his IV line. He looked at the restraint marks on his wrists and the suture line down his torso, and the leg that had been rebuilt with hardware and surgical mesh, and was still, on its best days, not entirely trustworthy. I can barely walk, he said. I know, Diane said. I'm running a fever of 104. 102.7 as of 9 minutes ago. It's coming down. She checked her watch. We have 91 minutes before Stan's break. Marcus closed his eyes one more time. He ran the math. He ran it the way he had run hundreds of calculations on hundreds of ridgelines, assessing distance and wind and variables and the gap between what was possible and what was not. He ran it with the part of his brain that the fever hadn't touched, the deep operational core that 20 years of the hardest training in the world had built to be essentially fireproof. He opened his eyes. You're going to owe me a significant amount of bourbon when this is over, he said. Diane Cross almost smiled. I'll buy the bottle, and you're going to explain to me, he said, exactly what we're going to do when we get out of this building. Because I am a man with one functional leg, a wanted poster in a federal database, and no resources. And you are a woman who just went off the books in a military hospital, and somewhere out there Conrad Voss has a private security army and a $6 billion reason to make sure neither of us ever talks. I have a plan, Diane said. You'd better have a very good one. My father, she said, was a paranoid survivalist who didn't trust the government. I spent my entire childhood thinking he was crazy. She reached back into the supply cart. I stopped thinking that about 3 years ago. She lifted a small, hard-sided case and set it on the bed beside him. She opened it. Inside, nestled in foam, was a military-grade encrypted hard drive, a burner satellite phone, and a folded piece of paper with an address in the Appalachian Mountains written in her handwriting. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. 91 minutes, he said. 88 now, she replied. He reached up and began, very carefully, detaching the monitoring leads one by one. 88 minutes became 70, then 50, then 30, and the clock on the wall of room 402 felt less like a timepiece and more like a detonator counting down to something that couldn't be undone. Diane had looped the central monitoring feed at 0100 hours exactly. The tablet she pulled from her scrub waistband was not standard issue for anything, and Marcus didn't ask where she got it because he had spent enough years in classified spaces to recognize equipment that didn't come from a civilian supply chain. She spliced a pre-recorded biometric loop into the station's output with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this specific thing before, or at minimum had rehearsed it enough times in her head that her hands knew where to go without instruction. On the screens at Carol Tate's nursing station, Marcus Hale's heart rate would read 102 beats per minute, elevated but consistent with a patient fighting active infection. His oxygen saturation would hold at 94%. His temperature would show 102.1. Every number telling the same story it had been telling all night. Stable, monitored, present, none of it real. "You have done this before," Marcus said. It came out flat, not accusatory, just a man calibrating what he was working with. "I've planned it before," Diane said, not looking up from the tablet. "This is the first time I've actually executed it." "That is not the reassuring distinction you think it is. You want reassuring, or you want out of this building?" He didn't answer because the answer was obvious. Getting a 200-pound man with a reconstructed left leg, 3 infected gunshot wounds, and a fever that was only now beginning to negotiate a retreat into a sealed body bag required the kind of pragmatic brutality that neither of them commented on while it was happening. Diane braced his weight from the left side while he moved. He suppressed the sounds his body wanted to make because sound traveled in hospitals at night the way sound traveled in forward operating bases. Farther than you expected and always to the wrong ears. "Breathe through it," she said quietly when his vision grayed at the edges. "Working on it," he said through his teeth. "Go somewhere else in your head." "I'm in a body bag in a hospital at 0115. There is nowhere else." She almost laughed. He heard it in her exhale. Not the nervous laugh of someone who was scared and covering it, but something genuine and brief and surprising. The laugh of a person who hadn't expected to find anything funny and was caught off guard by it. He filed that away. It told him something about her that the credentials and the classified codes and the 3 years of carried guilt hadn't told him. It told him she was still in there, under all of it. Still a person. The zipper closed over his head, and the world became plastic and dark and chemical-smelling and very small. He regulated his breathing the way he had regulated it on 100 missions inside enclosed spaces, counting the rhythm, keeping the heart rate deliberate, refusing to let the lizard brain run the math on confined spaces and limited oxygen, because that math never produced useful results. He felt the gurney unlock. The wheels engaged. The journey from room 402 to the elevator lobby was approximately 40 feet of corridor, and it took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. And it was the longest 3 minutes and 40 seconds of Marcus Hale's life, which was a significant claim given his biography. Every sound was magnified. The squeak of the left front wheel, slightly off true, tapping a rhythm on the linoleum. The distant hum of the HVAC system, his own heartbeat, which he was monitoring with the detached clinical attention of a man who needed it to stay quiet and was asking it politely. Then voices, close. "Night, Diane," Carol Tate's voice, from the direction of the nursing station. Tired, routine, completely unaware. Marcus stopped breathing entirely. "Good night, Carol." Diane's voice was perfect, the exact register of a nurse at the end of a productive shift. Nothing elevated, nothing compressed. "Got a quiet one finally. Fever broke about an hour ago. I'm just taking this down and grabbing more saline on my way back up." A pause. 1 second. 2. "Thank God," Carol said. "Maybe we'll actually get through to morning without another incident." "Fingers crossed," Diane said. The gurney kept moving. Marcus let himself breathe again, a slow, controlled exhale through his nose, and he thought with absolute clarity that Diane Cross had missed her calling because what she had just done in that 30-second exchange required a specific and practiced ability to occupy a role completely, to not just say the lines, but to be the person saying them. And that was not a skill that came from nursing school. The elevator lobby, the call button, the wait. The ding of the elevator arriving was, to Marcus inside the bag, approximately the loudest sound he had ever heard in his life. Louder than artillery, louder than the mortar that had taken out the ridge 3 years ago. He was aware this was subjective, but the awareness didn't make it less true. They rolled in. The doors closed. The floor dropped away beneath him. The basement air hit him when Diane unzipped the top of the bag. Cold and carrying the particular stillness of a space where no one needed to pretend anything. He pulled it in, and it was the finest air he had ever breathed. "Clear," she said. "Next time," Marcus said, "we take the stairs." "You can't take the stairs." "I know, I'm registering a complaint for the record." She was already moving, pushing the gurney toward the loading bay at the pace of someone on a deadline, which they were. Stan Kowalski had 7 minutes left on his break. The loading bay doors were ahead. Through the small reinforced window in the upper panel, Marcus could see the dark outline of a vehicle backed up to the ramp. Black, plain, the rear doors facing them. "The hearse is actually a modified transport van," Diane said, reading his expression. "Restful Gardens Funeral Home. My contact left it unlocked. The registration is clean. We've got 3 hours before anyone notices it's not at the depot." "Your contact," Marcus said. "Former NSA colleague. She doesn't know what it's for. She thinks I'm helping relocate a witness," which is technically accurate. Marcus pushed himself up from the bag, swinging his legs over the side of the gurney with a grinding effort that he refused to acknowledge verbally. His left leg accepted his weight with the sullen protest it had been lodging for 3 years. The deep bone and hardware ache that lived permanently below the level of whatever painkiller he was currently running on. He stood, unsteady for a moment, then less so. Diane moved to the bay doors, and a shadow stepped away from the wall beside the vehicle. She stopped. The man who stepped into the light was wearing a suit that cost more than the van. Silver hair, precisely cut. The smile of a man who had spent decades in rooms where everyone else was afraid of him and had come to experience that fear as ambient background noise, like white noise, comfortable, expected. His eyes, even at this distance, in this light, were doing what Marcus had noted at Bagram 3 years ago. They were counting inventory. "You're off shift early, Nurse Cross," Conrad Voss said. His voice was the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "And you appear to be absconding with government property." His eyes moved to the body bag on the gurney, then to Marcus, standing beside it. The smile didn't change. "Master Chief Hale, you look considerably better than you did when I checked the monitoring feeds at 2200. That's inconvenient." Marcus said nothing. He was calculating distance, angles, his own current physical capacity, and the degree to which the last variable was going to complicate all of the others. Voss reached into his jacket. The pistol that came out was suppressed, which meant he had come here expecting to use it in a place where noise would be a problem. That was not the weapon choice of a man improvising. That was the weapon choice of a man executing a plan. "Step away from the gurney, Diane," Voss said. His tone was almost kind. "You're a smart woman, genuinely. Former NSA, exceptional analyst, the kind of career that doesn't grow on trees. You walk away from this loading bay tonight, you disappear. You take whatever you've been carrying for 3 years and you bury it somewhere deep, and you live the rest of your life in peace." He let that sit for one beat. "Or you stay where you are and you become a tragic footnote. Unstable former intelligence analyst, substance abuse history, broke into a military medical facility, made paranoid and violent threats against—" "There is no substance abuse history," Diane said. "There will be by morning," Voss said pleasantly. "The records are already being prepared. It's very sad, honestly. Brilliant woman. Couldn't cope with the guilt of the Korengal operation. Mental health crisis, violent break-in, tragic outcome in the parking structure. He raised the pistol, aiming it at the center of her chest. So, step away. Diane raised her left hand. In it was a small remote, plain plastic, a single button on top of a spring-loaded plunger, the type that required constant thumb pressure to stay in the safe position. A dead man's switch. Voss's eyes dropped to it, and the smile fractured by approximately 2 millimeters. The hospital's oxygen main line runs along the east wall of this basement, Diane said. Her voice was completely level. It also runs through this loading bay, feeding the surgical suites 2 floors up. I spent 45 minutes down here last Tuesday during my orientation walkthrough. It's a remarkably accessible infrastructure. She let her thumb rest visibly on the plunger. I'm not a chemist, but I did spend 6 years analyzing weapons procurement data for the NSA, and I can tell you that the particular combination of pressurized oxygen feed and the materials I source from a hospital cleaning supply closet produces a very significant result if the circuit is completed. Voss stared at her. You'd kill yourself, he said. I'd kill all 3 of us, she said, which is one more trade I'm willing to make than you are. The loading bay was silent except for the hiss of something pressurized somewhere behind the east wall and the distant sounds of a hospital continuing to function with no awareness of what was happening in its basement. Voss was calculating. Marcus could see it. The micro-expressions of a man running probabilities on whether she was telling the truth, whether the device was real, whether her psychology matched the threat profile. The problem with calculating Diane Cross's psychology, Marcus had come to understand in the last 2 hours, was that her psychology did not follow the civilian pattern that Voss was likely running his model against. She had carried a classified, encrypted drive for 3 years and held her silence. She had walked into room 402 with a man who had put a maintenance worker through a wall that morning. She had looped a federal medical facilities monitoring system with hardware she had sourced and prepared on her own timeline. Her threat threshold was not where Conrad Voss's actuarial table said it would be. Voss's gun hand was steady, but his eyes had gone slightly careful. That was the opening. It was not much of an opening. Marcus had a compromised leg and active sepsis and was running on borrowed adrenaline and spite. But he had spent 20 years finding the opening in situations that didn't appear to have one. He had been doing it so long that the part of his brain that found openings had become essentially involuntary, like breathing. He looked at the gurney beside him. 160 pounds of metal and hard plastic on unlocked wheels. He looked at the angle. He kicked the brake release. The gurney went forward with the full weight of its momentum, and it hit Conrad Voss at the knees with the indiscriminate force of physics. Voss went down. The gun discharged. The suppressed shot was still loud in the enclosed space, and it took out the rear window of the transport van in a shower of glass. Diane moved. She grabbed the heavy steel oxygen tank from the rack mounted on the bay wall beside her. The emergency portable unit that lived in every hospital loading bay for exactly the kind of situation the hospital had never imagined this would be. And she swung it with both hands in the full rotational momentum of a woman who had been waiting 3 years for the moment when she finally got to do something with all the weight she had been carrying. It connected with Voss's right temple with a sound that ended the discussion. He went down and stayed down. The loading bay was silent. Marcus stood beside the overturned gurney, breathing through the pain that the last 45 seconds had detonated in his left leg. He looked at the unconscious form of Conrad Voss on the loading bay floor. He looked at Diane, who was standing with the oxygen tank still in both hands, her chest heaving, her hair partially loose from its tie. The dead man's switch, Marcus said. She looked at her left hand. She was holding the keys to the transport van, a garage door opener fob attached to the keychain. She looked at him. He looked at the garage door opener. It was a garage door opener, he said. He didn't know that, she said. A sound came out of Marcus Hale that he hadn't produced in 3 years. A short, involuntary, genuine laugh. It hurt his ribs considerably. He did not care at all. "Get in the van," Diane said, already moving to help him. "We have 4 minutes before Stan comes back from his break." They got in the van. Diane drove the way she did everything, fast and without wasted movement, pulling out of the loading bay ramp and into the dark Virginia night before the bay doors had finished closing behind them. Marcus was in the back, propped against the sidewall, the portable IV she had connected running antibiotics directly into his arm from a bag she had taped to the interior roof. He watched the hospital lights recede through the van's broken rear window. Walter Reed. 4 floors of people who had been trying to save him and kill him simultaneously, and he was leaving both behind at 55 miles an hour in a funeral home vehicle driven by a woman who had just knocked out a defense contractor with an oxygen tank and bluffed him with a garage door opener. The night was dark. The highway was mostly empty. Diane drove without speaking for the first 20 minutes, running through a sequence of lane changes and exit ramps and on-ramps that was methodical enough to be a counter-surveillance pattern, and probably was. Then she said, without taking her eyes off the road, "How's the leg?" "Functional," Marcus said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at the ceiling of the van. "It's bad. Probably set back the healing 3 weeks." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be." He paused. "You traded 3 weeks of healing for the rest of my life. I'll take that math." She didn't respond to that. He heard something in her silence that was complicated and old and not ready to be spoken yet, and he let it be. "Voss will be found in approximately 90 minutes, she said. "When he is, the first calls go to his security team, not the police. He won't want the police, not until he controls the narrative. That gives us a window." "How big a window?" "Big enough if we move right," she said. "The drive in the case is encrypted with a rolling key. To crack it, we need the source algorithm from Axiom's internal server architecture. Without that key, the raw intercept data I've been carrying for 3 years is just numbers. It proves nothing to anyone." "So we need to get into Axiom's servers," Marcus said. "Their secure logistics facility in Northern Virginia maintains the encryption infrastructure for all their classified contract data. It's also where their financial ledgers live, the ledgers that show 3 years of payments routed through Pakistani intermediaries to Taliban-affiliated commanders in Korangal province." Marcus turned this over. "How do we get in?" "Voss is hosting a charity gala there in 4 days, Diane said. "Wounded Warriors fundraiser. He does it every year. It's his favorite piece of theater. He invites decorated veterans to stand in his atrium while he collects tax deductions from defense lobbyists." The ugliness of that sat in the van for a moment. "He uses the men he broke," Marcus said quietly, "to raise money and build goodwill." "Yes. And we walk in through the front door. You walk in as a private security consultant attached to a donor. I walk in as your +1. We don't breach the perimeter. We enter through the main gate with forged credentials, locate the server room in the sub-basement, connect the drive, extract the decryption key, upload the evidence package to a pre-positioned distribution list, and walk out." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You said 4 days. 4 days. I need 4 days to be able to walk without the leg telling everyone in the room that something is wrong." "I know," Diane said. "That's why I built 4 days into the plan." He looked at the back of her head, the particular set of her shoulders, the way she held the wheel, both hands, 10 and 2, the unconscious discipline of someone whose body defaulted to operational posture, even when it didn't need to. "You built the whole thing," he said. "The timing, the gala, the credentials. You built it before tonight." She didn't answer immediately. "How long have you been building it?" he said. 3 years, she said, give or take. The highway stretched ahead of them through the dark hills of Western Virginia, and somewhere behind them in a hospital basement, Conrad Voss was unconscious on a loading bay floor with a fractured orbital bone and a story that was already coming apart at every seam. And above the cloud layer, too high to see and too quiet to hear, something that might have been a drone held its position and watched the van's taillights disappear into the mountains. The cabin existed at the end of a gravel track that the map didn't acknowledge, and the County Road Commission had apparently decided to forget. It sat in the western slope of the Appalachians, where the tree line came down close, and the nearest neighbor was 4 miles of ridge and hollow away, and the only sounds at night were the wind and whatever lived in the dark between the pines. Diane's father had built it in 1987 with his own hands, in his own money, and a conviction that the day would come when a man needed a place the government didn't know about. He had died 2 years ago, still waiting for that day. His daughter had arrived instead. The first 48 hours were about survival in the most immediate medical sense. Marcus's leg had taken the night's exertions as a personal offense and was expressing its objection in the form of swelling and heat that Diane monitored with the focused attention of someone who understood that infection in a compromised limb could end a mission faster than any enemy. She had packed the supply case with enough antibiotics, wound dressings, and IV materials to run a small field clinic, which told Marcus something about the level of planning that had gone into a rescue operation she had been calling improvised. "You packed for a week," he said on the second morning, watching her inventory the medical supplies on the cabin's kitchen table. "Optimistically," she said. "What's the pessimistic version?" 2 days in an emergency room in West Virginia under a false name. He looked at the ceiling. "How many false names do you have?" "Enough," she said, and moved on to the next item. By the third day, his temperature had dropped to 99.1 and stayed there, which Diane called a victory with the restrained satisfaction of someone who had learned not to celebrate anything that wasn't fully finished. He was off the IV. He was eating. He was doing the brutal, humiliating work of learning to trust his rebuilt leg again in the 40 feet of space between the cabin's back door and the woodpile. Back and forth, while Diane sat on the porch steps with coffee and watched without commenting on the degree of difficulty she could clearly see on his face. On the fourth morning, she taped a blueprint to the wall of the cabin's main room. Marcus stood in front of it with his coffee and studied it the way he had studied 1,000 target packages over 20 years of service. Axiom Defense Solutions Secure Logistics Facility in Culpeper County, Northern Virginia. To anyone driving the state road past it, it presented as a distribution warehouse for a mid-sized shipping contractor. The signage was bland. The parking lot held ordinary vehicles. The landscaping was maintained to a level that suggested corporate competence without excess. What the exterior did not show was the electrified perimeter fence set back 40 feet inside the tree line, the thermal camera array on the roofline, the armed patrol rotation that Diane had clocked at 15-minute intervals based on 3 separate site surveys she had conducted over the preceding 6 months, which was another data point in the accumulating picture of how long she had been building this. "Gala starts at 7, Diane said, joining him at the blueprint. "Guests arrive through the main gate with credential check. The atrium is the former warehouse floor, converted for events. Bar, tables, a stage for the speech-making portion. Voss usually speaks at 8:30. Dinner service at 9. And the server room," she pointed to the sub-basement level on the blueprint. "Below the main floor, single stairwell access from the east side of the building, staff only, keypad entry. The servers that hold the encryption architecture for all classified contract data are in the northeast quadrant. The financial ledger system is integrated on the same network." She tapped the northeast corner. "We connect the drive here, initiate a handshake with the rolling key algorithm, extract the decryption code, and the upload to the distribution list runs automatically. Washington Post, New York Times, FBI Cyber Division, and the Senate Armed Services Committee staff director, who has been quietly investigating Axiom's payment routing for the last 18 months. How long does the upload take?" 3 minutes at the server's internal bandwidth, maybe 4. And if we're interrupted, the upload is automated. Once initiated, it runs on its own process. I can pull the drive and the upload continues from the server's buffer. But if someone physically accesses the server terminal and interrupts the handshake before it reaches the distribution threshold, the data dies, Marcus said. The data dies, she confirmed. He studied the patrol patterns she had marked, the camera positions, the single stairwell. He did the math on his leg, on his current physical status, on the gap between what the operation required and what he could honestly deliver. I need a suit, he said. Diane smiled briefly. Already handled. The credentials she had built were the work of someone who understood federal contractor vetting systems from the inside. The donor she was attaching them to was a retired hedge fund manager named Warren Shell, who existed in the Axiom donor database as a mid-tier contributor, and who had in reality been added to that database 6 weeks ago by someone with access to the contractor's external-facing CRM system, who had built the record carefully enough to survive a surface-level credential check. Marcus looked at his new identity on the laminated card. I haven't worn a suit since my sister's wedding in 2018. You'll manage, Diane said. I look like a veteran with a limp in a suit. You're attending a Wounded Warriors fundraiser. So does half the room. He conceded the point. They arrived in Culpeper County at 5:45 in a clean sedan that Diane had sourced through a rental agency in Roanoke, under one of the names he had decided not to ask about. Marcus was in a dark charcoal suit that fit well enough and sat uncomfortably in ways that had nothing to do with the tailoring and everything to do with the fact that he hadn't worn civilian formal wear in 8 years, and his body had strong opinions about it. Diane was in a navy dress that was simple and appropriate and completely unremarkable, which he had come to understand was her preferred camouflage in civilian settings. Be the thing that nobody looks at twice. The credential check at the main gate took 40 seconds and produced no complications. The guard scanned the card, checked the name against the list on his tablet, looked at Marcus's face with the practiced incuriosity of a man who had been checking the same type of wealthy donor all evening, and waved them through. Marcus touched his earpiece as they walked toward the main entrance. It was a commercial unit, the type available at any electronics retailer, connected to the encrypted channel they had tested twice at the cabin. Reading clear, he said quietly. Clear on my end, Diane said beside him without moving her lips in any visible way. The atrium was exactly what Diane had described, and simultaneously exactly what Marcus had expected and found harder to stand in than he had anticipated. The chandeliers were genuine crystal, which was an interesting aesthetic choice for a building that was functionally a fortress. The champagne was real. The appetizers were passed by uniformed servers who moved through the crowd with the trained invisibility of people who worked expensive events for a living. And scattered through the room, in wheelchairs and on crutches, and with the particular physical markers of men who had left pieces of themselves in places that the people holding the champagne glasses would never visit, were the veterans. Marcus knew 2 of them. He recognized their faces from the community, from the network that connected special operations veterans, the way family networks connected civilians. He kept his expression neutral and his sightline away from direct recognition. He was a man in a beard who had gained 30 pounds of muscle from his hospital weight and was wearing a suit and moving with a slight limp at a fundraising event. He was not the ghost of Ramadi. He was not the man whose military ID photo was currently appearing in federal missing persons bulletins under the headline, Desertion and Assault. He was Warren Shell's security consultant, and Warren Shell's security consultant was bored and professional and entirely unremarkable. At 8:17, he touched his ear, moving to the stairwell. Camera on the east wall goes on a 40-second rotation, Diane said from her position near the bar. You have a window in 90 seconds. I'm going to need 3 minutes to reach you from my current position. Meet me at the keypad. Confirmed. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried deliberateness of a man looking for a restroom. The staff-only door was exactly where the blueprint had placed it. He was through it and into the service corridor before the camera completed its rotation, pulling the door shut behind him with a careful pressure that produced no sound. The stairwell descended one level. He took it at the pace his leg would allow, which was faster than it would have managed 4 days ago, and slower than he wanted. Diane came through the door behind him 40 seconds later, no longer in the navy dress. She had stripped it to reveal a dark underlayer, practical and close-fitting, and she had the drive in her hand and a compact electronic brute force unit attached to her wrist that she pressed against the sub-basement keypad without breaking stride. 30 seconds, she said. We don't have 30 seconds, Marcus said. He heard footsteps in the corridor above, heavy, deliberate, security making an unscheduled sweep, which meant something had already tripped a passive alert somewhere. Someone's running a check. 20 seconds. The footsteps were descending. Marcus moved to the wall beside the door and went still. The footsteps reached the landing above, paused, and a voice spoke into a radio. Brief, clipped. The response was inaudible from his position, but the tone of it was routine enough that the footsteps resumed upward rather than continuing down. The keypad beeped green. In, Diane said. The server room was cold the way server rooms always were, the cooling systems running hard to manage the heat output of the hardware. Diane was at the main terminal in seconds, the drive connected, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a speed that Marcus had stopped being surprised by. He positioned himself at the door. Initiating handshake, she said. Upload is at 12%. The system is trying to run an authentication rejection. I'm bypassing it. A pause. 20%. Then the ceiling light shifted. A single red LED joined the ambient lighting, pulsing slowly. Silent alarm. They know, Marcus said. 35%. I need 3 minutes. You have less than 1. The sound from the corridor was unmistakable. Not the single set of footsteps from a security patrol. Multiple sets, tactical spacing, the particular rhythm of people who were moving to contain a location rather than investigate it. 45%, Diane said. Her voice was controlled, but the pace of her typing had increased. If I pull it now, the data is incomplete. The distribution list gets fragments. It proves nothing. Marcus checked the door. No window, no view of what was coming. He pulled the weapon they had taken from Voss's unconscious bodyguard at the hospital, a compact 9mm he had been carrying for 4 days, and hoped he would not need to use. He checked the magazine by feel, 7 rounds. The door handle turned. He stepped back, let it open, and moved with the economy of a man who had done close quarters work in spaces smaller than this. The first contractor through the door was large and trained and expecting resistance. He was not expecting the specific combination of a stripped doorframe grab, a rotational throw, and a precise strike to the carotid that Marcus delivered in the time it took the man to fully register that the room was occupied. He went down without making the sound he had been opening his mouth to make. The second man came through a half-second behind. Marcus used the first man's weight against the door to buy himself the angle he needed. Pop! The suppressed shot went into the ceramic plate at the center of the man's chest, and he folded backward into the corridor. 60%, Diane said. I need the door barricaded. I'm out of angles on this position. She didn't look up. She pulled a length of server rack cable from the floor beside the terminal and threw it to him without breaking her typing rhythm. He jammed it through the door handle and around the fixed shelving unit on the wall with the improvised competence of someone accustomed to working with what was present rather than what was preferred. 70%. The door shuddered. They had found the 2 men in the corridor. The voice on the other side was commanding, professional, and very close. Breach in 30 seconds, Marcus said. 80%. Diane, I know. The door shuddered harder. Something heavy was being used against it. The cable was good, but it was cable, not steel, and the math on its durability was not favorable. 85, 90, metal shrieked against the doorframe. The cable was pulling the shelf mount from the wall. 95, come on! She was talking to the upload now, not to him. Come on! The shelf mount gave. The door came open. Marcus fired 2 controlled pairs through the opening at chest height and heard the response from body armor doing its job. The heavy, concussive thud of men winded, but not down. And then he grabbed the door and drove it shut again with his own body weight behind it because he had nothing else left to use. Done, Diane said. She yanked the drive from the port. It's out. It's everywhere. All 4 channels. Move, Marcus said, and he meant it. She was already at the ventilation grate near the floor, the one he had identified on the blueprint as the maintenance access to the underground parking structure. She had the cover off in 4 seconds. Go. You first. She didn't argue. She went through. Marcus came through behind her, pulling the grate back into position with the last cooperative movement his arms were going to offer for a while. And they dropped onto the concrete floor of the parking structure and ran. Not elegantly. Marcus was running on adrenaline and the 3-year-old hardware in his leg, and a determination that had nothing to do with physical capacity and everything to do with the fact that Danny Rourke's name was on that data, and it was going to reach the people who could do something with it, or he was going to die trying to make it so. The exit ramp was 50 yards north. They were 30 yards from it when the voice came from the far end of the structure. I wouldn't. Marcus stopped. Diane stopped. Conrad Voss walked into the light from behind a black armored Suburban. He was wearing a tuxedo that had survived the evening without a crease. The fractured orbital bone from the oxygen tank had given him a bruising below his left eye that the makeup he had apparently applied had not entirely concealed. And something about that detail, the vanity of a man who had gone to the effort of concealing a wound before attending his own charity gala, was more chilling to Marcus than the 4 contractors flanking him. Each contractor had a weapon raised. Each weapon had a laser sight. There were 4 red dots distributed across Marcus's chest, with the professional spacing of people who had been told to make absolutely certain. In Voss's right hand was a remote, the thumb pressed down on the plunger in the familiar posture of a dead man's switch. His eyes moved to Diane's hand and found it empty, and the smile that crossed his face was the smile of a man confirming a calculation. No garage door opener this time, Voss said. Diane said nothing. I monitored the upload, Voss said, stepping forward. His shoes clicked on the concrete with the metronomic regularity of someone who had never needed to hurry. You think you've won. You've uploaded fragments to news organizations and a federal inbox that my attorneys will tie up in classification review for the next 18 months, by which time the narrative will have been set. He looked at Marcus. You called in a Western non-combatant at Korengal. You were suffering from acute psychological distress. Your credibility as a witness is approximately 0, and the data without the decryption key is already decrypted, Diane said. The clicking footsteps stopped. I didn't need your server architecture, she said. I never needed it. I needed you to believe I needed it so that you would focus your security response on the server room while the actual decryption ran on a remote system I connected to 3 hours ago through your facility's external maintenance port. She met his eyes. The rolling key algorithm your cryptography team built has a flaw in the 4th rotation sequence. I found it 14 months ago. I've been sitting on the decrypted data for 14 months, waiting for a witness. The 4 red dots on Marcus's chest stayed where they were, but Voss's thumb on the dead man's switch had shifted. Barely. By 2 millimeters. The kind of shift that meant the calculation had changed, and the man running it knew it. The gala guests are currently receiving a push notification on their phones, Diane continued. So is every journalist who covers the defense industry in Washington. So is the FBI duty officer at the Hoover Building. The decrypted files include 3 years of payment records. the original, unaltered signal intercepts from Korangal, and a full communication log showing the coordination between your logistics office and the ambush that killed 4 members of SEAL Team 6 on November 14th, 2021. Her voice did not waver. "It is done, Conrad. It was done before we walked through your front door." Voss looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Marcus. And Marcus saw the moment when the man who had never worried about consequences understood, for the first time in his adult life, that consequences had arrived and they had his name on them. "Drop the weapon," Voss said to his contractors. His voice was still level, but something beneath it had gone. "Drop them." He looked at the remote in his own hand. His thumb was still on the plunger. The C4 on the pillars was still live. The building above them still held 300 people who had come to drink his champagne and listen to his speeches and write him checks. Marcus watched his face, and in the silence of that parking structure, with the sirens that had been building for the last 4 minutes, finally resolving into the unmistakable wail of federal law enforcement arriving at the main gate, Marcus Hale made the same decision he had made in the hospital room 10 days ago when the doctors had wanted to put him into a coma and a woman had whispered a code that cut through everything. He chose the harder thing. He stepped forward and took the remote from Conrad Voss's hand, not fighting for it, not grabbing it, simply stepping into the space of a man who had run out of moves and placing his palm beneath the switch and taking it with the calm authority of someone who had decided how this ended. Voss led him. "Hands," Marcus said. Voss looked at him with an expression that Marcus would think about for years afterward. Not defeat exactly, something more complicated. The expression of a man who had been building an empire on the specific calculation that men like Marcus Hale could be aimed and spent and discarded, and was only now, standing in his own parking structure with his own dead man's switch in someone else's hand, confronting the error in that arithmetic. He put his hands up. The federal agents came down the ramp 60 seconds later with weapons drawn and voices raised, in the particular controlled chaos of a law enforcement breach that knew it was reaching the end of something significant. Marcus and Diane were already on their knees with their hands visible, which was the only language that mattered in that first minute, and Marcus kept his eyes on Voss the entire time. Watching the man who had ordered Danny Rourke's death get handcuffed on a concrete floor in his own building, while his charity guests stood confused in the atrium above, was not the moment Marcus had imagined Jige 3 years of pain and surgery and rage. It was quieter than he had imagined, more ordinary, more human. That was the thing about justice, he thought. It didn't come with a score. It came with a click of handcuffs and a man in a tuxedo being walked up a parking ramp by federal agents, and the absence of everything that had been holding you down. Diane was beside him, her shoulder against his, her breathing steady. "The data is clean?" Marcus asked quietly. "Every file," she said. "Jige, coordinate, every transmission, every coordinate." The weight that had been sitting on his chest since a ridge in the Korangal Valley in November of 2021 did not lift all at once. It shifted. It began, for the first time, to belong to the past instead of the present. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The first 48 hours after the arrest were not freedom. They were a different kind of cage. The federal holding facility in Alexandria, Virginia, smelled of institutional coffee and the particular anxiety of people waiting for lawyers. Marcus and Diane were separated on arrival, processed through different intake corridors, and placed in different interview rooms with different agents who asked variations of the same questions in different orders for 8 hours straight. It was a technique Marcus recognized. He had been on the other side of it enough times to know exactly what they were doing and why, and knowing didn't make it any less exhausting. The agent assigned to him was a woman named Reyes, FBI counterintelligence, who wore her skepticism the way some people wore jewelry, visibly and with intention. "Walk me through the hospital again," she said, for the third time. Same answer as the first two, Marcus said. Humor me. Someone forged prescribing credentials to order a lethal medication dose into my morning IV line. Diane Cross identified the order, informed me of the threat, and assisted me in leaving the facility before it could be administered. Everything that happened after that was in service of getting the evidence to people who could act on it. You assaulted 3 security contractors. I neutralized 3 armed aggressors who were attempting to prevent the transmission of evidence of federal crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and material support to designated terrorist organizations. I used the minimum force required. Reyes wrote something on her pad. Conrad Voss's legal team is characterizing the event as a break-in and a theft of proprietary data. Conrad Voss's legal team is going to have a difficult few months, Marcus said. The data was already public when those characterizations were filed. Reyes looked at him for a moment, then she set her pen down. Off the record. Nothing is off the record in a federal interview room. She almost smiled. Fair, then on the record. She leaned forward slightly. The data Diane Cross uploaded includes communication logs that implicate personnel currently serving in active DoD positions, senior positions. This is not a case that resolves cleanly or quickly. You understand that. I understand that, Marcus said. The people you're accusing of facilitating the Korengal ambush include at least 1 current flag officer. I know. That means this gets complicated in ways that have nothing to do with whether you're telling the truth. Marcus looked at her directly. It got complicated 3 years ago when Danny Rourke took a round to the neck on a ridge that someone put us on intentionally. We're past the part where simple was an option. Reyes held his gaze for a long moment. Then she picked her pen back up and wrote something else. In the room down the corridor, Diane Cross was doing something that Marcus would not learn about until 6 hours later. She was not answering questions. She was asking them. Specifically, she was asking the senior FBI agent across from her why, if the agency's cyber division had received a version of the Korengal intercept data 14 months ago through an anonymous channel, the file had been logged as received and then categorized as unverified foreign intelligence, and moved to a dormant review queue where it had sat without action. The agent across from her was a man named Carver, who had 23 years in the Bureau, and who went very still when she said this. You sent the original data 14 months ago, he said, a partial version, enough to establish the payment routing and the coordination timeline. Encrypted, sourced through a blind drop account. I included a decryption key for the first 2 layers. She met his eyes. It was logged as received by this office on March 14th of last year. Case number is in the metadata. Carver left the room for 11 minutes. When he came back, his expression had changed in the specific way that the expression of a federal agent changes when they have just discovered that the problem they thought they were managing is substantially larger than they believed. The file was redirected after intake, he said carefully, to a secondary review queue managed by a counterintelligence liaison office. Managed by whom? Diane said. Carver looked at her. That is currently under active internal review. That's the answer that tells me everything, Diane said. The wire went everywhere that night. By 11 p.m., the Washington Post had the full decrypted payment records on their secure server. By midnight, the Times had run the first piece online, careful and sourced and devastating in the specific way that well-sourced journalism is devastating when the facts are simply allowed to speak without embellishment. By 2 a.m., the Senate Armed Services Committee had issued a statement announcing an emergency closed session for the following Monday. By 3 a.m., Axiom Defense Solutions stock had halted trading. By 4 a.m., a retired brigadier general named Harold Stokes had retained counsel and declined to comment on reports that his name appeared in the Korengal payment coordination logs. Marcus learned all of this not from a television in a federal holding room, but from Agent Reyes, who came back into his interview room at 4:15 a.m. and set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. He took it as the indicator it was. "Your status is being reclassified," she said. "The Walter Reed incident is being reviewed in context of the threat documentation. The assault charges from the Axiom facility are complicated by the fact that 2 of the 3 men you engaged were not licensed private security. They were active duty contractors operating outside their authorized domestic deployment parameters, which is a problem for several people and not for you." She sat down. "This is going to take time to fully resolve. The machinery moves slowly." "It always does," Marcus said. "But it is moving," she said, and the way she said it told him she meant it. They released him at 7 a.m. with a document that described his status as cooperative material witness and a phone number for a federal prosecutor's office that he was required to contact within 72 hours. He walked out of the building into the early morning air of Alexandria and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it. Diane was already outside. She was sitting on the low concrete wall at the edge of the parking area, with her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup, her hair loose now, watching the sky get light over the Potomac. She looked like a woman who had not slept and did not particularly mind. He sat down beside her. They didn't say anything for a moment. The city was starting its morning sounds around them, traffic building, the distant noise of a world going about its routine with no awareness of what had happened in a parking structure in Culpeper County the night before. "The file they suppressed 14 months ago," Marcus said, "Carver is going to find that it was redirected by a liaison officer whose name also appears in the payment logs," Diane said. "Someone inside the Bureau was running interference for Voss, probably for 18 months minimum. So there's another layer." "There's always another layer," she said. "But this one doesn't have the architecture anymore. Voss built the protection network. Without Voss at the center of it, the people who were covering for him are now people with exposure and no patron. They'll move to protect themselves, which means they'll cooperate. It unravels from the inside." She took a sip of her coffee. That's how these things end, not in a single dramatic moment, in a series of people deciding that loyalty to a collapsing structure is a worse bet than talking to a federal prosecutor. Marcus turned this over. He had spent his adult life operating in a world where problems were solved through direct action, where the distance between identifying a target and eliminating it was measured in seconds, in training and will. The world Diane inhabited, where the distance was measured in classified files, in legal proceedings, and institutional machinery that ground forward at its own pace, was a different discipline entirely. He was beginning to understand why she had spent 3 years building toward a single night. Patience was its own form of warfare. "Your clearance," he said. "Gone," she said. "Filed as revoked for conduct violations the morning after I left the hospital," which was expected. "Your nursing license?" "Under review, pending the Walter Reed investigation's conclusion." Also expected. She didn't sound particularly distressed about either of these things. She sounded like someone who had already done the accounting and made peace with the balance. "You burned everything," Marcus said. "I kept what mattered," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the river. Her profile in the early morning light was the profile of someone who was tired in the deep way that goes below physical fatigue. The tiredness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down and is still adjusting to the absence of the weight. "Rourke had a daughter," Marcus said. It came out quietly. "Emma. She was 3 when he deployed. She's 6 now." Diane didn't look away from the river. "I know. His wife, Karen, she's in San Diego. She never got a full accounting of what happened. The official casualty notification was combat action, hostile fire, classified operation. 3 sentences. His jaw tightened. She never knew why. She never knew it wasn't random. She never knew it was deliberate. Diane was quiet for a moment. "She will now." "Yeah," Marcus said. "She will now." He said it with a flatness that covered something that had no clean name. Not relief exactly, not resolution, Something more complicated. The feeling of a debt that could never be fully paid, but had finally been acknowledged by the universe, which was the closest thing to payment that this category of debt allowed. The morning continued to arrive around them. At 9 a.m., Reyes called Marcus's phone, the federal issue unit she had handed him on the way out, and told him that the Pentagon had issued a statement confirming an active investigation into the conduct of Axiom Defense Solutions and its contracted personnel in relation to the November 2021 Korengal Valley operation. At 9:45, the same statement was read on every major news network with the addition of Voss's name and the words treason and conspiracy in the same sentence. At 10 a.m., Marcus called Karen Rourke. He had not planned the call. He had not prepared language for it. He sat in the federal parking lot with the phone in his hand and dialed the number from memory. A number he had not used in 3 years because he had not known what to say. And when she answered on the second ring with the cautious hello of a woman who had learned to be careful about unexpected calls, he said her name. And she went quiet for a moment, and then she said his name back. And in the silence between those two names was everything that 3 years of incomplete information and unexplained grief had done to a family. "I know what happened," Marcus said. "I know why. And I am going to make sure Emma knows her father didn't die because of chance or bad luck or the randomness of war. He died because he was doing his job correctly and someone needed him not to do it anymore. He was the most professional operator I ever worked with, and he was a better man than any of the people who made that decision." His voice held, barely. "I'm sorry it took this long." Karen Rourke was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was the voice of someone who had been told something they needed to hear so badly that the relief of it was physically painful. "Are they going to be held accountable?" "Yes," Marcus said, "they are." He meant it as a promise. Over the following weeks, the promise kept itself. Conrad Voss was arraigned on 14 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, material support to a foreign terrorist organization, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and treason. His bail application was denied. He sat in a federal detention facility in Northern Virginia, in a room that cost somewhat less per night than the hotel suites he had occupied for the preceding 3 decades. Harold Stokes, the retired brigadier general, accepted a cooperation agreement. The liaison officer who had redirected Diane's original file accepted a cooperation agreement. 3 Axiom executives accepted cooperation agreements. The cooperation agreements produced additional names. The additional names produced additional proceedings. The machinery, once started, moved with the grinding inevitability of something that had been pointed at the truth and could not now be redirected. The Senate Armed Services Committee held its closed session, then held an open one. The testimony from that open session ran 6 hours and was watched by more people than had watched most things on television that year, which said something about what people were hungry for when someone finally told them the truth in plain language. Marcus testified for 4 hours. He wore his dress uniform. It was the first time he had worn it since the last memorial service he had attended, 3 years ago, for a man he had not been able to save on a ridge in the Korengal Valley. He put it on in the small apartment the government had arranged for him in Arlington, and he looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. The ribbons and the trident and the rank insignia that represented 20 years of service to a country he had continued to believe in, even during the years when the belief had cost him almost everything. He looked like himself. For the first time in 3 years, he looked like himself. The hearing room was full. He sat at the witness table and he told them what he had seen through a scope on a November night in 2021 and what it had cost and who had made it cost that much and why. He said Danny Rourke's name on the congressional record. He said the names of the other 3 men who had died on that ridge. He said them clearly and without qualification, and the chamber was quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something true is being said in them. When it was over, A senator who had served in Vietnam shook his hand and didn't say anything, just held the handshake for a moment, which was enough. 6 months after the parking structure in Culpeper County, a diner in Whitefish, Montana sat at the edge of town where the mountains started to take over from the GDK when the coffee was strong enough to mean something. It was the kind of place where the waitress knew your order by the third visit and GDK asked where you came from or where you were going. Because in that part of the country, people understood that sometimes a person needed to simply be where they were without explaining the distance they had traveled to get there. The woman behind the counter, a woman named Patty who had worked there for 30 years and had seen every variety of human being pass through those seats, refilled the mugs in the corner booth without being asked because that was the kind of attention she paid, and she had noticed that the couple in that booth had GDK enough to have earned a refill. The man had a beard that was trimmed now and a slight hitch in his left leg when he walked, and eyes that had the quality of someone who had looked at something very dark for a very long time and had come back from it without pretending it hadn't been dark. He was watching the small television above the counter where the national news was reporting a verdict. In a landmark ruling today, former Axiom Defense Solutions CEO Conrad Voss was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The convictions represent the most significant private military contractor prosecution in the history of the federal judiciary and stem from evidence provided by an anonymous source identified in court records only as Sierra 1. Patty watched the couple in the corner. The man looked at the television for a moment. Then he looked at the woman sitting across from him. She had a napkin on the table in front of her with something sketched on it. The mountain range visible through the window, rendered in ballpoint pen with the practiced ease of someone who drew what she saw without needing to make it into anything more than what it was. She looked up. She met his eyes. She smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had stopped needing it to be anything other than what it was. Marcus Hale reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Outside the window, the Bitterroot Mountains held their position against the sky with the complete indifference of things that have been standing long before any of this and will be standing long after. And the morning light was coming through the glass clean and uncomplicated and honest. "You think they'll keep looking?" he asked. Diane looked out at the mountains. "Let them look," she said. "The man they're looking for died in a hospital room in Walter Reed. The ghost of Ramadi is gone." She turned back to him. "What's left is just you." Marcus picked up his coffee. It was hot and strong, and it tasted exactly like what it was. Not ash, not loss, not the long weight of a debt owed to the dead. It tasted like a morning that belonged entirely to the living. And that was the only victory that had ever mattered. And it was enough, and it was his, and no one could take it back.